So, back in 2008, deep in the Colombian jungle, there was this heavily armed guerrilla group that did something just, well, completely baffling.
Oh, it's one of the craziest events in modern history.
Right. I mean, for years, they had held this group of high-value hostages. We're talking a former presidential candidate, 3 American contractors, and they used them as their ultimate political leverage.
Right, the ultimate bargaining chip.
Exactly. But then, on this specific day, the guerrilla commanders just walk out of the tree line and hand their most prized captives over to this group of people. And they firmly believed these people were members of a neutral humanitarian organization.
Which, of course, they weren't.
No, not at all. The helicopters lift off, the hostages are safe. And the truly wild part here, not a single shot was fired.
Not one.
Yeah, I mean, no alarms were even raised until the helicopters were literally miles away. It was this flawless military rescue, but executed entirely without a conventional military assault.
They didn't blow the camp up.
No, they didn't have to.
Yeah.
They exploited the adversary's social and communication network so completely that the enemy, well, they essentially defeated themselves.
It is just one of the most stunning examples of modern operational art, precisely because it defies everything we see in, Hollywood or read in standard military history books.
Oh, absolutely.
That rescue, Operation Jacques, it wasn't a product of overwhelming firepower. It was the result of years spent painstakingly mapping out the human terrain, intercepting communications, and really just deeply understanding the psychological vulnerabilities of that guerrilla network. They injected themselves right into the middle of the enemy's decision-making cycle.
So welcome to the shadows, everyone. Today, we were taking you on a deeply specialized journey into the murky, complex, and absolutely fascinating world of modern global competition.
It really is a fascinating world.
It is. Our mission for this deep dive is to completely reshape how you view conflict. We're looking at how wars are actually fought and won, or rather, how strategic victories are achieved, entirely outside the boundaries of traditional warfare.
Which is where things get really complicated.
Extremely complicated. We're going to explore how military forces interact with civilian populations and why quietly frustrating an adversary's master plan is often, far more devastating than engaging their military head-on.
And we have a phenomenal stack of highly specialized source materials on the table today to guide this exploration.
We really do. We are pulling from 3 distinct, incredibly dense documents. First, we're looking at the official military doctrine, Joint Publication 357 on Joint Civil Military Operations, published in April of 2025.
A very hefty document.
Oh, yeah, it's massive. Second, we have a comprehensive, highly detailed RAND Corporation report titled Strategic Disruption by Special Operations Forces.
Also excellent.
And finally, we are integrating a brilliant operational framework proposed in Special Warfare magazine by Brian L. King. It's an article aptly titled Strategic Disruption, an operational framework for irregular warfare.
To really grasp why these documents matter, you have to understand the fundamental identity crisis that traditional militaries face today.
Right, the whole paradigm shift.
Exactly. For decades, military strategy has been built around a very clear, highly systematic playbook. The terminology used for this is large-scale combat operations.
Okay, large-scale combat operations.
Right. When a military planner sits down to design a campaign for large-scale combat operations, they have a massive, well-defined library of doctrine.
They know exactly what to do.
Exactly. They know exactly what the mechanisms of defeat are. They understand how to move armor divisions, secure airspace, establish supply lines. I mean, it is a world of metrics, geometry, and just overwhelming force.
Right. It's that classic force-on-force paradigm. You line your tanks up against their tanks, and basically whoever has the better technology, training, and mass wins.
That's the idea.
But as Brian L. King points out in his Special Warfare magazine article, that comforting, mathematically predictable playbook completely falls apart the moment you step into the realm of irregular warfare.
It shatters completely.
Yeah. Historically, irregular warfare has operated in this intellectual vacuum. There hasn't been a unified operational framework. Instead, you've had 100 different commanders interpreting the mission 100 different ways.
Which leads to immense strategic ambiguity.
Totally. Planners are basically asked to fight a ghost, and they don't even have a shared vocabulary to talk about it.
And that is incredibly dangerous when your primary adversaries are actively avoiding conventional battlefields.
Right. They aren't going to meet us on an open field.
Exactly. They know they cannot win a tank battle in the open desert, so they just refuse to show up for one. They operate in the gray zones.
Using proxies, economic coercion, cyber attacks, disinformation.
All of that. And if your only response to that is to thumb through the manual for large-scale combat operations, you have already lost.
Yeah, you're preparing for a chess match while your opponent is actively burning down the building.
That is exactly the massive problem our sources are trying to solve today. And the solution they present is this unifying concept called strategic disruption.
Let's define what this actually is, because the Rand report and the Special Warfare article spend a lot of time establishing the parameters here.
It's important to be precise.
Yeah, because strategic disruption is not just a random assortment of covert raids. It is defined as a proactive campaign of tactical actions designed specifically to delay, degrade, or deny an adversary's preferred strategy for achieving their objectives.
And all while remaining entirely short of traditional declared war.
Right, that's the key. It's about targeting the strategy itself, rather than just attacking physical forces.
Brian L. King uses an analogy in his article that perfectly captures the underlying philosophy here. He points to a 1982 book by Joe Hyams called Zen in the Martial Arts.
I love this analogy.
It's so good. In one of the chapters, a martial arts master tells his student that when you're faced with a powerful competitor, you basically have two strategic choices. You can either grow your own line, or you can cut your opponent's line.
And growing your own line is pretty much what we spent the entire Cold War doing, right?
Basically, yes.
Building more nuclear submarines, drafting more soldiers, creating faster fighter jets. You are just trying to outscale the opponent.
Right, you're just making your line thicker. But cutting your opponent's line requires a completely different mindset. You aren't trying to be bigger, you're trying to make sure their strategy simply cannot function.
Exactly. So strategic disruption is the formalized art of systematically cutting the opponent's line. It requires you to study an adversary, figure out exactly how they intend to achieve their goals, identify the load-bearing pillars of that plan, and then quietly knock those pillars out one by one.
You are introducing friction into their system.
Yes, friction. The sources describe this using the concept of cumulative stress, which instantly makes me think of the sand pile model from physics. Let's dig into how that actually works as a mechanism of warfare.
Okay, yeah, let's look at the physics of it.
So in physics, if you slowly drop grains of sand onto a flat surface, they form a pile. And for a long time, the pile just absorbs the new sand. It looks stable.
But underneath, the tension is building.
Exactly. The system is reaching what physicists call self-organized criticality. And then one single, completely ordinary grain of sand hits the pile, and the entire structure collapses in a massive avalanche.
It is a brilliant way to understand irregular warfare. Because in conventional conflicts, you are looking for massive, decisive blows. You want to drop a boulder on the sand pile.
Right, just smash it all at once.
But in strategic disruption, you are acting as the individual grains of sand.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
A cyber attack on a logistical hub here. The arming of a local resistance group there. A subtle shift in the informational environment somewhere else.
And to the adversary, each individual action might just seem like a manageable nuisance, right?
Exactly. It doesn't cross their red line for declaring a full-scale war. But over months or years, these tactical actions alter the structural integrity of their entire national strategy. The friction builds.
The costs multiply.
And eventually, their operational design collapses under its own weight.
So if the overarching philosophy is to quietly cut the opponent's line by adding grains of sand until their system breaks, we really need to know the rules of engagement. I mean, how does a modern military force actually govern itself in this shadowy environment?
Well, the Rand Corporation report provides a rigid structure for this by outlining 3 core tenets of strategic disruption.
Okay, let's walk through those.
The first tenet is that the force must be proactive, which sounds obvious, but in the context of Western military tradition, it is actually a radical shift.
How so?
Well, for decades, the default posture of Western nations in the gray zone has been defensive and reactive. An adversary launches a disinformation campaign, and we scramble to issue a press release denying it. An adversary funds a proxy militia, and we scramble to fortify an embassy.
Right, we are constantly playing whack-a-mole on the adversary's timeline.
Exactly, whack-a-mole. The proactive tenet demands that forces seize the initiative to gain deliberate advantage. You do not wait for the adversary to act.
You identify where they're trying to go, and you move there first.
You set favorable conditions. You mine the cognitive and physical terrain before they even arrive. You dictate the pace, the location, and the terms of the competition, forcing the adversary to constantly react to your moves.
Which flows naturally into the second tenet, right? That strategic disruption must directly frustrate adversary-preferred strategies. I actually find the phrase preferred strategies really revealing.
It is a very deliberate choice of words.
Yeah, it implies that nation-states operate kind of like electricity. They want to take the path of least resistance.
They absolutely do. Every actor on the global stage has an idealized vision of how an operation should unfold. They have a budget, a timeline, and a threshold for political embarrassment.
Right.
To frustrate that strategy means you study their design and you introduce agonizing complexities. Let's say their preferred strategy relies on moving illicit materials through a specific maritime choke point because it's cheap and unmonitored.
Okay.
You do not necessarily sink their ships. You quietly expose that route to the international press. Or you assist the local Coast Guard in increasing random inspections.
Oh, wow. So suddenly their cheap, invisible route becomes expensive and highly visible.
Exactly. You force them to adapt. And in adaptation, organizations make mistakes, they burn resources, and they alienate their allies.
You're making their chosen path so excruciatingly difficult that they either abandon the objective or they make a fatal miscalculation. And that sets the stage for the third tenet, which I think really broadens the aperture of what we're discussing here. The third tenet states that strategic disruption must enable multiple instruments of national power.
This is critical.
Right. We're talking about diplomatic, informational, military, and economic instruments. The military is not acting as a lone wolf here.
This is the most crucial takeaway regarding the purpose of special operations forces in this framework. Their tactical actions are not the end goal.
They are the setup.
Yes. By imposing friction on an adversary's military or intelligence apparatus, they carve out maneuver space for the rest of the government.
Let's contextualize this using the doctrine from Joint Publication 357 because it fundamentally changes how we view the global landscape.
It throws out the old rule book.
It really does. Most people, when they look at international relations, they see a binary switch. The world is either at peace or it is at war. But the doctrine explicitly throws that binary out the window. It introduces what is called the competition continuum.
Right, because the binary model is a dangerous illusion. The United States and its allies are in a constant, unceasing state of interaction with various state and non-state actors.
And the doctrine maps this interaction across three overlapping spaces: cooperation, competition, and armed conflict.
Cooperation is straightforward. That is, mutual defense treaties, trade agreements, joint training exercises. Armed conflict is your large-scale combat operations.
But that vast, murky middle ground competition is where strategic disruption lives.
Yes, that is the arena.
It is the arena where adversaries are aggressively pursuing their national interests at your direct expense, but they are carefully calibrating their actions to stay below the threshold that would provoke a conventional military response.
And honestly, this is where a lot of traditional military thinkers get deeply uncomfortable. They look at the competition phase and say, well, wait a minute. If our entire strategy in this phase is just to delay or frustrate the adversary, aren't we just managing a stalemate?
Right, and I actually want to push back on this exact point.
Go for it.
Imagine you are a policymaker. A hostile nation is actively trying to subjugate a neighboring democracy. If the military's only job is to introduce friction, to make the adversary's supply chains a little more expensive, or their political maneuvering a little more difficult, are we actually winning anything?
That's the big question.
Right. Or are we just perpetually kicking the can down the road, exhausting our own resources without ever achieving a decisive victory?
It is the most common critique of irregular warfare, without a doubt. But it fundamentally misunderstands the nature of modern geopolitical victory.
How so?
In the competition phase, victory is almost never a cinematic moment where the enemy general hands over his sword. Victory is the preservation of your own strategic advantage while degrading the adversaries.
Okay.
When you use special operations forces to impose costs and create dilemmas, you are manufacturing the most precious commodity in statecraft, which is time and space.
Okay, but time for what exactly?
Time for the diplomatic and economic instruments to actually work.
Ah, I see.
Diplomacy is incredibly slow. Building an international coalition to impose crippling economic sanctions takes months of delicate negotiation.
Right, you can't just snap your fingers and make it happen.
Exactly. If an adversary's preferred strategy is a rapid, covert annexation of territory, the diplomats do not have time to respond before it is a fait accompli.
Right, the territory's already gone.
Exactly. So by disrupting the adversary's timeline, by turning their rapid advance into a bogged-down, expensive quagmire, the military holds the door open. You are not kicking the can down the road. You are holding the adversary in place long enough for the economic sanctions to bite, for the diplomatic isolation to take effect, and for the informational campaign to strip away their international legitimacy.
So the military creates the conditions for the other branches of government to score the definitive win.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. You are shifting the burden of decisive victory off the shoulders of the infantrymen and onto the entire apparatus of the state.
Beautifully put.
So if we understand the philosophy of cutting the line, and we understand the tenets of being proactive and enabling diplomacy, let's look at the actual toolbox. How do forces physically execute this?
Well, the RAND report breaks this capability down into 5 distinct pillars.
5 pillars.
These 5 pillars represent the core competencies of special operations forces when applied to strategic disruption. They are resist, support, influence, understand, and target.
So these are the physical mechanisms used to drop the grains of sand on the adversary's strategy.
Exactly.
Let's examine these thoroughly, starting with the first pillar, resist. The doctrine defines this as enabling a resistance movement or an insurgency to coerce, disrupt, or overthrow an occupying power or a hostile government.
And the historical case study the RAND report provides for this is absolutely legendary.
It really is. We are going back to the dense jungles of Burma during World War II, looking at the Office of Strategic Services, specifically Detachment 101.
To understand the impact of Detachment 101, you really have to look at the strategic geometry of the Pacific Theater.
Set the scene for us.
So the Japanese military had occupied Burma, and their preferred strategy was to use it as an impregnable anchor to protect their western flank and secure vital resources.
Okay.
Now, a conventional Allied assault into Burma would have required massive troop deployments, which would draw vital resources away from the island-hopping campaign that was aimed straight at the Japanese mainland.
So instead of sending divisions of conventional infantry, they sent Detachment 101 behind enemy lines.
Right.
And their initial footprint was incredibly small. They didn't drop in to fight the Japanese army directly. They dropped in to integrate with the local Kachin tribesmen.
Because they understood that the Kachin people had a deep-seated grievance against the Japanese occupation. The Office of Strategic Services operatives provided weapons, training, and organization, basically transforming a fractured tribal population into a highly lethal, synchronized resistance force.
But the disruption wasn't just limited to physical sabotage, right? Though they certainly blew up their fair share of bridges and rail lines.
Oh, absolutely they did. But they also recognized that the center of gravity for the Japanese forces was their morale and their belief in the inevitability of their victory.
This is where the psychological warfare component of the resist pillar comes into play. Detachment 101 engaged in what is called black propaganda.
Yes.
They didn't just drop leaflets saying the Allies are coming.
Yeah.
They carefully crafted messaging designed to slowly erode the psychological foundation of the Japanese soldiers.
They circulated rumors about supply shortages, disease outbreaks, strategic failures elsewhere in the Pacific.
Right. They countered the highly sanitized, optimistic propaganda that the Japanese high command was feeding its troops.
And think about the systemic friction that creates. The Japanese military command in Burma suddenly found themselves fighting a two-front war. They had to deal with the conventional Allied threat on their borders, but internally, their supply lines were bleeding.
Because their patrols were constantly ambushed by invisible local forces.
Exactly. And their troops were psychologically deteriorating, doubting the truth of their own orders. Japan had to divert immense logistical resources and thousands of troops just to maintain basic security within their own occupied territory.
Wow. So Detachment 101 cut the Japanese line not by outgunning them, but by turning the very environment they were trying to occupy into a lethal, exhausting trap.
It is the ultimate expression of the sandpile model.
It really is.
Yes.
That brings us to the second pillar, support. Now, at first glance, support sounds like the exact opposite of resist. If resist is about tearing down a hostile power, what is support?
Support is the proactive application of force to build up the capacity of a legitimate foreign security partner, enabling them to defend themselves against internal subversion or external coercion.
So it's preventative maintenance on the global order.
That's a great way to put it. Instead of waiting for a partner nation to be overwhelmed by an adversary and then trying to mount a massive rescue operation, you deploy specialized forces to advise, train, and assist their military and law enforcement long before the crisis peaks.
And the modern example the sources point to is the complex dynamic in the South China Sea, specifically the United States providing support to the Philippines.
Which is incredibly relevant today.
Very relevant. The Philippines is facing intense daily pressure from Chinese maritime militia and naval forces. China's preferred strategy in that region is a textbook example of gray zone operations.
Absolutely textbook.
They use a massive fleet of ostensibly civilian fishing vessels, which are actually state-controlled maritime militias, to swarm disputed reefs and islands. They block supply ships, harass local fishermen, and slowly establish physical dominance over the territory.
It is a strategy of incremental annexation. And because these are technically civilian vessels or Coast Guard ships, if the United States or the Philippines were to respond with a naval destroyer and open fire, they would instantly be painted as the aggressor initiating a war.
Right.
China's strategy relies on keeping the temperature just below the boiling point, forcing the Philippines into a position where resisting seems entirely futile.
So how does the support pillar actually disrupt that?
By fundamentally altering the cost-benefit analysis for the adversary, the United States deploys special operations forces to work side by side with Philippine forces. They improve their maritime domain awareness.
Meaning their ability to track and identify these militia swarms using advanced sensors and intelligence sharing.
Yes. They train their special boat units to maneuver more effectively. They refine their command and control structures.
It sounds like they are basically making the Philippine forces more resilient, more professional, and harder to bully.
Precisely. By increasing the capability and the confidence of the partner force, you raise the operational cost for the adversary.
Right, because when the Philippine Coast Guard can effectively document, outmaneuver, and publicly expose these coercion tactics without escalating to lethal force, it completely frustrates China's preferred timeline.
Yes. The cheap, quiet annexation becomes a prolonged, highly public, and diplomatically damaging ordeal. The support pillar grows the partner's line, which inherently cuts the adversary's line.
I see. Which brings us to the third pillar, influence. This one steps away from the physical movement of troops and boats and dives straight into the cognitive domain.
The cognitive domain is so important here.
The doctrine defines influence as operations designed to shape the attitudes, behaviors, and decisions of foreign actors in a way that aligns with your strategic interests.
It is the recognition that human perception is a battle space. If you can alter how an adversary perceives reality, you can alter their behavior without ever touching them.
And the Rand Report highlights another World War II operation for this pillar, and honestly, it reads like a spy thriller. Operation Sauerkraut, executed in Italy in 1944.
Oh, this is a brilliant example. The context here is vital. The Allies had landed in Italy, and they were facing a grinding, brutal advance up the peninsula against heavily entrenched German forces.
The German defensive lines were formidable.
They were. A purely conventional approach meant unimaginable casualties for the Allies. So the Office of Strategic Services looked at the problem and realized that the German army's strength, its rigid discipline and strict hierarchy, was also its greatest vulnerability.
Because if an organization relies entirely on unquestioning obedience to top-down orders, what happens when those orders suddenly seem insane, or when the troops no longer trust the people issuing them?
Exactly. So the Office of Strategic Services identified German prisoners of war who had become profoundly disillusioned with the Nazi regime.
Yeah.
They recruited these former soldiers, isolated them, and trained them for a highly classified infiltration mission. They provided them with flawlessly forged documents, paybooks, travel orders, identification papers, but more importantly, they armed them with specific, highly tailored disinformation.
They infiltrated these recruited prisoners back behind the German lines. I mean, these guys are wandering around in German uniforms inside German-controlled territory, and they start distributing counterfeit proclamations.
Right under their noses.
Yeah. They nailed fake orders to trees. They spread rumors that high-ranking German generals in Berlin were actively mutinying against Hitler and that localized surrenders were being secretly negotiated.
Think about the psychological impact of that on a freezing, exhausted German infantryman in a trench in Italy. The disinformation was specifically engineered to exploit the existing anxieties of the troops.
It created a contagion of paranoia.
German commanders suddenly found themselves second-guessing their own subordinates. They had to dedicate military police and intelligence officers to hunt down the source of these rumors. The trust within the units began to fracture.
It is the ultimate strategic disruption. The German commander's preferred strategy was a disciplined, coordinated defense in depth. Operation Sauerkraut frustrated that strategy by attacking the cognitive glue that held their military together. They weaponized doubt.
And that leads us to a crucial realization. You cannot weaponize doubt, you cannot build a resistance force, and you cannot train a partner military if you do not have a flawless comprehension of the environment you are operating in. Which brings us to the fourth pillar, understand.
The understand pillar.
Mm.
The RAND report defines this as the capability to extract strategically relevant information from politically sensitive, highly contested, or completely denied environments. This isn't just looking at satellite imagery to count tanks.
No.
This is about penetrating the human terrain.
Traditional military intelligence is fantastic at the physics of warfare. They can tell you exactly how thick the armor on an enemy tank is, or the maximum range of a missile system. But the understand pillar is about mapping the anthropology of the conflict.
Right. Who holds the real power in a village? What are the historical grievances between two local tribes? How does an illicit financial network actually move its money?
And the sources provide two radically different case studies for this pillar, which really shows how versatile it is. The first takes us to the Balkans in 2014 during the catastrophic Bosnian floods.
Right, and to the casual observer, a flood is just a natural disaster. It requires a humanitarian response. What does that have to do with strategic military competition?
Well, in the gray zone, everything is an opportunity for strategic advantage. The Balkans are a highly contested environment. Following the devastation of the floods, both Russian and Serbian state actors immediately saw an opportunity.
Okay.
Their preferred strategy was to rush in with aid and use the crisis to assert their own geopolitical influence, while simultaneously pushing narratives that undermine the legitimacy and the capability of the Bosnian government and its armed forces. They wanted to prove that Bosnia was a failed state that needed foreign, specifically non-Western, oversight.
But the United States Special Operations Forces that deployed to assist with the disaster relief didn't just arrive blind. They had been operating in the region for years. They possessed a granular, deeply nuanced understanding of the civil actors, the local political fault lines, and the specific historical sensitivities of the population.
And because they possessed that deep understanding, they were able to maneuver through the crisis in a way that a conventional military unit simply could not.
They didn't just hand out water bottles.
No, they deliberately structured the relief operations to place the Bosnian armed forces at the forefront of the effort. They facilitated coordination between local mayors, emergency services, and the national military in a way that explicitly highlighted the Bosnian government's competence.
Wow, so they recognized the Russian influence campaign, and they preempted it not by fighting the Russians, but by understanding the local dynamics so perfectly that they could engineer a response that validated the partner nation.
They disrupted the adversary's narrative by mastering the human terrain.
That is incredible. And the second example of the understand pillar takes us back to the hook we opened the episode with, Operation Jacques in Colombia in 2008.
Ah, yes.
The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia had an entire strategy built around holding hostages in a completely denied environment, the deep jungle. You can't just send a spy in there to ask questions.
You cannot. The jungle canopy protects them from satellites, and the isolated nature of the camps protects them from traditional infiltration. But the Special Operations Forces, working seamlessly with Colombian intelligence, spent years building an exhaustive structural understanding of how the guerrilla group actually functioned.
They didn't just want to know where the camps were.
Right. They wanted to know how the commanders communicated, who authorized supply drops, what were the specific codes and radio frequencies they used to verify identity.
They mapped the social and logistical network so completely that they discovered a vulnerability. The guerrilla units holding the hostages were highly compartmentalized. They relied on a very specific, rigid chain of communications to get orders from the Central High Command.
And once they understood that network, they exploited it. They compromised the communications architecture. They began issuing fake orders, perfectly mimicking the tone, the codes, and the protocols of the guerrilla high command.
They ordered the local commanders to consolidate the hostages and hand them over to an international humanitarian group for relocation.
And because the intelligence forces so thoroughly understood the internal culture of obedience and the technical mechanisms of their communications, the guerrillas never questioned the order.
The understanding of the network was so absolute that it negated the need for violence.
It's just staggering.
It really is, and it perfectly sets up the fifth and final pillar, target. When people hear target, they usually think of conventional strikes, A drone launching a missile at a compound or a submarine firing a torpedo.
In large-scale combat operations, that is exactly what targeting is. But in the realm of strategic disruption, the target pillar is surgical, precise, and often non-kinetic. It is about seizing, destroying, or disrupting key infrastructure or personnel in a way that fundamentally alters the adversary's capability without necessarily crossing the threshold into armed conflict.
The ultimate textbook example of this, which the Iran report outlines, is the Stuxnet cyber weapon. We have to look at the geopolitical reality surrounding this. Iran was aggressively pursuing a nuclear program, and their preferred strategy was to enrich uranium at a highly fortified underground facility in Natanz.
And the international community, particularly the United States and Israel, viewed this as an unacceptable threat to global stability. But a conventional military strike sending bombers to destroy Natanz would have almost certainly ignited a massive, catastrophic regional war.
The diplomatic fallout would have been immense. A conventional strike was deemed too costly.
So instead of dropping a bomb, they developed Stuxnet.
Right.
This was a piece of malicious software, a cyber weapon of unprecedented sophistication. But it wasn't designed to just crash computers or steal data. It was a targeted physical attack executed through digital means.
It was incredibly specific. Stuxnet was engineered to target the precise industrial control systems that managed the physical spinning of the Iranian centrifuges.
And once it infected the system at Natanz, it did two things simultaneously. First, it subtly manipulated the speed of the centrifuges, causing them to spin out of control and physically tear themselves apart.
Oh, wow.
But second, and this is the true genius of the targeting, it intercepted the telemetry data coming from the centrifuges and played back normal, healthy operating data to the Iranian scientists monitoring the screens.
Wait, really? So the scientists are sitting in the control room looking at their monitors and everything looks perfectly fine. The temperature is normal, the speed is normal.
Exactly. Meanwhile, in the next room, their multi-million-dollar hardware is literally tearing itself to shreds.
Think about the secondary effects of that. Not only did Stuxnet physically destroy the machinery, delaying the enrichment program by years, but it also destroyed the confidence of the Iranian scientific community.
They couldn't trust their own instruments. They spent months trying to figure out if it was a mechanical failure, human error, or sabotage. It created a paralysis within their entire organizational structure.
It is the perfect encapsulation of the tenets we discussed earlier. It was proactive. It entirely frustrated Iran's preferred timeline for enrichment. And most importantly, by setting the program back years, it bought the international community the time and space necessary to implement crippling economic sanctions.
And bring Iran to the negotiating table, eventually resulting in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The military targeting enabled the diplomatic instrument.
Precisely. Resist, support, influence, understand, and target. These are the tools.
They are.
You know, what really strikes me when I look at these 5 pillars is how closely they mirror the force employment mechanisms used in conventional wars. If you read a manual for large-scale combat operations, it tells commanders to defeat the enemy by using mechanisms like destroy, dislocate, isolate, or disintegrate. The 5 pillars are essentially the exact same architectural concept. They provide a menu of options for a commander to translate the abstract philosophy of strategic disruption into tangible, measurable actions on the ground. They are the mechanisms of defeat adapted for the shadows.
That is exactly how military planners are meant to utilize this framework. But here is where the entire conversation has to pivot and where the true complexity of modern operations is revealed.
Okay, lay it on us.
You cannot execute these pillars in a vacuum. You cannot build a resistance force. You cannot influence a foreign public. And you absolutely cannot map a human network for the Understand pillar without intimately, constantly interacting with the local civilian population.
And that reality is the bridge connecting the sharp, shadowy edge of special operations forces directly into the incredibly dense, bureaucratic, and vital world of joint civil-military operations, which is the sole focus of our first source document, Joint Publication 357.
This doctrine exists because the military has finally realized that the population is no longer just the terrain upon which a war is fought. The population is often the objective itself. The doctrine refers to this as the civil component of the operational environment.
Let's clearly define what the civil component entails. When a traditional general envisions a battlefield, they are looking at topography. They see mountains that block line of sight, rivers that require bridging, and road networks for moving armor. But what does the civil component look like?
The civil component is the living, breathing infrastructure of human society. It comprises the political systems, who makes the laws and who enforces them. It is the economic systems, how people get paid, where the markets are, who controls the illicit smuggling routes.
Right.
It includes social systems, religious institutions, tribal hierarchies, ethnic divisions, and it includes the physical infrastructure that keeps the society alive: hospitals, water treatment plants, power grids, and telecommunications networks.
In strategic disruption, if you ignore the civil component, you are operating entirely blind. Joint Publication 357 outlines that managing this incredibly chaotic environment requires a systematic approach called civil-military operations.
And the doctrine breaks this massive undertaking down into 3 core sequential functions: dialogue, alignment, and integration.
Let's walk through these, starting with civil-military dialogue.
Civil-military dialogue is the foundational step. It is about establishing the why. Before a single soldier deploys or a single operation is launched, military commanders and civilian leaders must sit down and agree on the fundamental nature of the problem they are trying to solve.
And I assume we're not just talking about United States government civilians here.
No, not at all. We are talking about host nation governments, local mayors, international humanitarian leaders.
Because different organizations look at the exact same geographic region and diagnose completely different diseases. The military intelligence officer might look at a province and say, well, the core problem here is insurgent violence funded by a foreign proxy.
But a representative from the United States Agency for International Development or a local non-governmental organization will look at that exact same province and say, no, the violence is just a symptom.
Right.
The actual problem is a catastrophic drought that destroyed the agricultural sector 3 years ago, leading to mass unemployment and food insecurity, which is making young men susceptible to radicalization by the insurgents.
If those two groups do not engage in civil-military dialogue, they will design competing strategies. The military will focus entirely on kinetic targeting of the insurgents, while the civilian agency focuses on drilling wells and providing seed packets.
Exactly. Without a shared understanding of the root cause, their efforts will ultimately cancel each other out, or worse, exacerbate the problem.
Once that dialogue establishes a shared baseline understanding, you move to the second function, civil-military alignment. This is the process of coordinating the diverse activities of military forces and civilian agencies so that they are harmonized toward a unified, overarching goal.
You are trying to make sure everyone is rowing the boat in the same direction, even if they are in different boats.
As I was reading through this massive section on alignment in the doctrine, an analogy kept surfacing in my mind. It feels exactly like trying to manage a hostile corporate merger between two massive, ideologically opposed companies right in the middle of an active crisis, like a natural disaster.
That's a fascinating way to look at it. Explain how you see the cultures clashing in that scenario.
Well, think about the military structure first. The military is the ultimate top-down hierarchy. It is rigid, disciplined, and entirely focused on mission accomplishment. Orders come from a joint force commander and flow down through highly structured echelons.
Right.
They possess immense logistical power. They can build a runway in a day, fly in tons of cargo, and secure a perimeter. But their entire worldview is filtered through the lens of security, threat mitigation, and achieving dominance.
They're built to command and control.
Right. But on the other side of this merger, you have the civilian world. You have United States government agencies like the Department of State. You have massive United Nations organizations like the World Food Program or UNICEF.
And then you have dozens, sometimes hundreds, of independent non-governmental organizations operating in the space groups like Doctors Without Borders or the Red Cross.
Exactly. And these civilian organizations are structurally the exact opposite of the military. They're often flat, highly decentralized, and consensus-driven. They do not take orders from a military general.
And critically, they possess entirely different operational imperatives.
Exactly. The biggest friction point is the concept of neutrality. For many non-governmental organizations, their strict neutrality is their only armor. Their ability to cross front lines, negotiate with warlords, and deliver life-saving medical care depends entirely on all factions, viewing them as an impartial, non-combatant entity.
If a doctor working for a neutral humanitarian group is seen riding in the back of a United States military Humvee or utilizing military intelligence to plan a clinic, they instantly lose that neutrality.
And they become perceived as an extension of the military force, which immediately makes their clinics and their personnel legitimate targets for the adversary.
The military is looking at the non-governmental organization saying, we can protect you, we can give you supplies, just let us coordinate your movement.
And the non-governmental organization is saying, if we let you coordinate our movement, you will get us killed. The cultures are fundamentally at odds. So how on earth does civil-military alignment actually occur? How do you force these two massive, stubborn entities to work together without compromising their core identities?
This necessitates the third and most complex function, civil-military integration. This is the daily, grinding, continuous process of adjusting operations to ensure unified action. To solve the profound structural and cultural clash you just described, the military cannot just absorb the civilians.
Right, that wouldn't work at all.
They have to create dedicated, specialized mechanisms for coordination. And the crown jewel of this effort, as detailed in Joint Publication 357, is the Civil Military Operations Center.
What does that actually look like on the ground? Is it just a tent with a big table?
Well, it can be a tent, it can be a rented hotel ballroom, or it can be a secure virtual network. But physically and conceptually, a civil military operations center is deliberately positioned outside the wire of the heavily classified, restricted military tactical operations center.
It is designed to be a neutral, accessible meeting ground.
Exactly.
Who is inside?
You have military liaison officers who specialize in civil affairs. You have representatives from the United States Embassy. You have local government officials, police chiefs, and utility managers. And you open the doors to whoever from the United Nations or the non-governmental organization community chooses to attend.
So it is a clearinghouse for unclassified information.
Yes. It is where the military can say, we are conducting a major clearing operation on Highway 4 tomorrow, so please do not route your aid convoys down that road. It allows for deconfliction.
It allows the military to leverage their logistical heavy lift capabilities, like using transport planes to fly in water purification systems, and hand them over to the civilian agencies for actual distribution, keeping the lines of neutrality intact.
The doctrine also makes a fascinating distinction. It notes that in scenarios of massive, catastrophic humanitarian crises, like a devastating earthquake or a tsunami, the military might not be the lead agency at all. In those cases, they operate within a humanitarian operations center.
Wait, what's the difference between a civil military operations center and a humanitarian operations center?
The distinction is entirely about authority and optics. A civil military operations center is established and run by the military force to coordinate with the civil sector. A humanitarian operations center, however, is typically established and led by the affected host nation government or by an international body like the United Nations.
Oh, I see.
In a humanitarian operations center, the United States military is not in charge. They sit at the table as just one of many supporting partners, offering their unique capabilities like helicopters for search and rescue and service to civilian leadership.
But whether they are operating through a civil military operations center or a humanitarian operations center, none of this coordination matters if they don't actually understand the environment. And this is where Joint Publication 357 introduces the engine that drives this entire apparatus. Civil information management.
Civil information management is the exhaustive, systematic process of gathering, analyzing, synthesizing, and distributing raw data about the civil component we defined earlier. It is the intelligence cycle applied to human society.
The scope of what they are tasked with collecting is mind-boggling. We're not just talking about counting populations. They are mapping the intricate webs of local power structures. Who is the formal mayor and who is the informal tribal elder that actually commands respect?
They are evaluating the capacity of local hospitals. Do they have trauma biz? Do they have backup generators? What is their supply of blood?
They are identifying critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. They are mapping the locations of toxic industrial hazards. If there's a massive chemical fertilizer plant sitting in the middle of a contested city, every single actor needs that information.
The military planners plotting in urban advance need to know it so they don't accidentally bomb a chemical tank and gas a neighborhood. The humanitarian agencies need to know it so they can plan emergency evacuation routes downwind of the facility.
And here's where we tie everything we've discussed today into one cohesive knot. If we connect this doctrine of civil information management back to the RAND report on strategic disruption, you realize that the two concepts are inextricably linked.
They absolutely are.
Civil information management is the fuel that powers the pillars of disruption.
You cannot execute the Understand pillar without the exhaustive data mapping provided by civil information management. You cannot successfully deploy the influence pillar like the psychological operations we saw in Operation Sauerkraut. If you do not know which radio stations the local population trusts or what historical grievances they hold, which is exactly what civil information management uncovers.
Right, so the hard surgical edge of special operations forces executing strategic disruption is entirely 100% dependent on the foundational, unglamorous work of joint civil-military operations.
It is a closed loop. The military cannot disrupt the adversary's strategy without intimately understanding the human environment, and they cannot understand the human environment without integrating with the civilian world, negotiating with non-governmental organizations, and mapping the social terrain.
And achieving that level of integration while simultaneously managing the friction of a gray zone conflict is arguably the most complex, demanding maneuver in modern statecraft.
It really is.
We have covered an immense amount of incredibly dense, paradigm-shifting material today in this deep dive. We started by diagnosing a massive vulnerability in how traditional militaries view the world, their over-reliance on the rigid, predictable playbook of large-scale combat operations, and their historical blindness to the nuances of irregular warfare.
We explored the remedy provided by the RAND Corporation and Special Warfare magazine, which is the comprehensive framework of strategic disruption.
We looked at the philosophy of cutting your opponent's line, recognizing that applying cumulative stress, dropping those individual grains of sand, can cause an adversary's preferred strategy to collapse without ever declaring a formal war.
We detailed the 3 tenets that govern this approach: being relentlessly proactive, directly frustrating the adversary's preferred path, and crucially, creating the time and space necessary for the diplomatic, informational, and economic instruments of national power to secure the ultimate victory.
We unpacked the 5 tactical pillars used to execute this strategy: resist, support, influence, understand, and target. We traveled from the jungles of Burma and the psychological warfare of World War II, to the modern maritime coercion in the Philippines, to the digital sabotage of Stuxnet.
And finally, we anchored all of those shadowy, covert operations in the complex, bureaucratic reality of the civil environment, diving deep into Joint Publication 357.
We saw how dialogue, alignment, and integration are absolutely vital to managing the profound cultural friction between strict military hierarchies and fiercely independent, neutral humanitarian organizations.
It requires a fundamental evolution in how we define national security. It demands patience, extreme precision, and a recognition that understanding the psychological and social terrain is just as critical, if not more so, than dominating the physical terrain.
The ultimate takeaway for you, listening to this deep dive, is a profound shift in perspective. When you read the news, when you look at global events, realize that the most sophisticated, high-stakes warfare happening in the world right now is entirely invisible to the naked eye. It is not happening with massive tank formations grinding across an open desert battlefield.
It is happening right now in the gray zones.
It is focused entirely on outcompeting adversaries within the fabric of civil society, subtly manipulating global infrastructure, and quietly, relentlessly sabotaging strategic plans before they can even be fully deployed.
As we conclude this exploration, I want to leave you with a final, highly provocative thought to consider. We have spent this entire deep dive dissecting the mechanics of how military forces can proactively disrupt the strategies of our global competitors.
Oh, yeah.
We have talked at length about finding an adversary's vulnerabilities, exploiting their social networks, and cutting their lines. But I want you to mentally flip the chessboard around for a moment. Look intimately at our own society. Look at our own critical infrastructure, our political discourse, and the deep, often fractured divides within our own civil-military relations.
Oh, wow.
In an era where information flows instantaneously across borders and where global supply chains are heavily intertwined and incredibly fragile, how resilient are our own preferred strategies?
It is a chilling question. Are we prepared as a society to recognize when an adversary is quietly working in the shadows against us? Are we capable of identifying when a foreign actor is using influence campaigns to fracture our unity, targeting our infrastructure to create delay, or weaponizing their understanding of our own social grievances against us? Are we paying close enough attention to subtle, cumulative stress being applied to our own systems right now? And most importantly, are we ready to realize when someone is actively working to cut our line?